Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our discussion today on electoral reforms and the outlook for free and fair presidential elections in Nicaragua in 2021. My name is Robert Destro. I am the Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the U.S. Department of State. In the nearly 2.5 years since Nicaraguan dictator Daniel Ortega's infamous repression of peaceful protesters, the need for democratic reforms has become ever clearer, especially as Nicaragua looks forward to its 2021 elections. But what will it take for Nicaragua to hold free, fair, and transparent elections in 2021 with equal multi-party participation? We have with me today to try and answer those questions and the way forward are Luis Almagro, Organization of American States Secretary General, Manuel Orozco, Nicaragua expert and director of the Center for Migration and Economic Stabilization at Creative Associates International, and Amiel Rios, Senior Nicaragua Program Manager at the National Endowment for Democracy. Welcome to you all. And I also want to mention that we've also got with us Ambassador Michael Kozak, Acting Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs here at the State Department, and among other things, my immediate predecessor in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. So let me briefly summarize the situation in Nicaragua before I turn to our panel for their views. The situation is not a good one, to say the least. Ortega's police and parapolice continue to violently quash all dissent. The judiciary, which is a judiciary in name only, hands down unjust sentences to political prisoners and legal procedures that lack due process. The regime has clamped down on independent media and civil society and doesn't tolerate dissent. Ruling party activists and pro-government groups have desecrated churches and attacked religious leaders through verbal and physical assaults, death threats, surveillance, and intimidation campaigns. The Ortega-Murillo regime has also rejected all international investigations of human rights abuses, ejecting delegations from the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, refusing entry to a high-level OAS commission, which included a US representative, and rejecting the reports of an OAS organized group of independent human rights experts and from Secretary General Almagro himself. Calls for meaningful electoral reform have become louder, both in Nicaragua and around the world. The OAS, through its various bodies, have recommended specific reforms since the flawed 2017 municipal elections. The opposition and national coalition in Nicaragua released in February a list of needed constitutional and electoral reforms, which the Ortega regime promptly ignored. Meanwhile, the coalition has continued to organize nationwide and coalesce around a unified platform so that it can run a candidate in next year's election. So let's look today at what's needed for the people of Nicaragua to move forward from within this bleak situation that I've described to a more open, free, fair, transparent, and credible election in 2021 with equal multi-party participation. Secretary General Almagro, Manuel, and Amiel, let me kick off our discussion with a question for all of you. And that is, what are the most essential electoral reforms that you think need to take place in order to set the stage for free, fair, and open elections? Secretary General, let me start with you. I think you're on mute.
I am on mute. The conditions now, of course, make it impossible to have a fair, transparent election in Nicaragua. The highest electoral authority of Nicaragua, the Supreme Electoral Council, lacks independence and impartiality It's just a tool to promote the interest of the executive and, of course, of the regime of Daniel Ortega. There are no possibilities in the lower electoral bodies are composed predominantly, but we can say in some cases entirely, with members of the ruling party and its allies. There is no official mechanism for publicizing or sharing information on the actions of the electoral bodies, resolutions passed by the Supreme Electoral Council. There is no political pluralism at all. Practically everything has been co-opted by the Sandinistas, by the Orteguism. Civil society organizations cannot monitor human rights situation and cannot have a say even in the electoral issues of the country. The voters registry is out of date. There is no permanent protocol for management, administration, or update or oversight of the voter rolls. The electoral dispute resolution is not fair, it's not transparent, it's not just. And these are just examples, but there are no political conditions to carry on an election. That is, the exercise of civil and political rights is not possible in the country these days. We have had permanent human rights violation during all this time, and we have no way of exercising guarantees of any kind. So this is the situation. The voting is important because it means a tool for the people in order to vote without knowing that they are opposing their regime. But you have to create the conditions in order that that possibility really exists and that this vote will really count and that there will be a result that can be respected. We don't have anything like that now in the country. So practically you can start reforming from A and you have to end reforming Z.
Mr. Orozco, what do you, how do you respond?
Well, I think the secretary pointed out basically how incomplete things are in Nicaragua. And you basically have the National Coalition has proposed 13 different recommendations or demands for political electoral reforms. And they have to do with certain independence of the Elections Commission, the Consejo Superior Electoral, Supremo Electoral, guaranteed electoral observation, national and international, as well as make reforms to the political party law that allows for the easing of restrictions on how to form a political party, as well as how to form political alliances. And this is particularly both a matter of procedure and substance. On the procedural side, you have a problem whereby the way the system is structured, it prevents any type of minority party to being created. And from the more substance side is that there is so much discretion on the Elections Commission to determine whether a new party can be formed. So those are three really important demands. The other ones have to do with independence on how fiscals are established in every electoral precinct, as well as issues relating to reforming the victory for a presidential election. Right now, it's 35% with a 5% difference. And that allows for a lot of manipulation of the electoral vote. So the opposition is requesting 50% plus one, which is the conventional electoral element for a victory. Aside from that, there are also fundamental political rights that need to be restored. For example, the law 699 is one that penalizes and criminalizes the right for street protest, the right for political and popular protest. So, within that context, Nicaragua is actually by law in a state with fundamental legal limitations for political rights. So those elements need to be changed as a minimum precondition. not considering all the list of all the other elements.
And, what do you think are before I turn to Mr. Rios, what do you think the chances of getting those things changed would be?
At this point, very limited. You have to make fundamental political reorganizing within the national coalition to increase pressure. Right now, they came at the stage where they arrived at a momentum where there is consensus on what are the electoral reforms, the minimum, these 13 points. But now their next challenge is to organize themselves territorially, to increase political pressure on the government, make more visible the support that they receive and gain more legitimacy from the popular and the electorate Nicaraguans. And that's one of the major challenges, plus support from the international community. And it's a formidable challenge. It's not going to be easy. The next 6 months under the current pandemic are basically distracting everyone of thinking about politics. So you have to push with more energy the political landscape to get the government to accept. At the same time, there is a problem of governance. Even the state is not able to cater even these most basic public policies. There is no a real governing body, and to some extent Nicaragua is becoming something of a Haiti in the context where there is almost anarchy. There is not a unified elite, nor from the opposition, nor from even the current circle of power. So things are deteriorating at a rapid speed. So things are not in good shape.
Mr. Rios, what do you have to say about the issue?
Yes. First, thank you for the opportunity of being here in the panel, Assistant Secretary, and it's definitely a pleasure. I just want to add that there is a political dimension here that goes in parallel to the technical reforms that need to take place, and it's what is and Manuel was sort of referring to this. What will it take for Ortega to accept the reforms that the coalition is presenting for free and fair elections to happen? And I think there needs to be more international pressure put on the regime for those reforms and for that enabling environment to happen. The pressure needs to be stronger, firmer, and it does seem that that's the only language that the regime will understand. The democratic forces have made significant advances, most recently these reaching a consensus on the electoral reforms that must take place, but they're still not strong enough to create the necessary pressure to force Ortega to accept these reforms. So the work of the domestic democratic forces must be supported by swift, strong, assertive international pressure.
Well, if I can, let me follow up. And there's pressure, and then there's pressure. And so the question is, all right, who is it that needs to be lined up, that Mr. Ortega would listen to? I mean, because, if Ambassador Kozak and I, were to write a nasty letter to President Ortega, he would use his little basketball hoop on the wastebasket to throw it away. So the question is, who will he listen to?
First of all, it is very difficult to say what Ortega fears. What does he fear? It is very difficult to say. We know what he doesn't like, but we don't know what he fears, and that is a real challenge. he's of the leaders in the region, maybe the most cold-blooded that exists, and he's he's very difficult to permeate pressure into him. That's very difficult. We know what he doesn't like. He doesn't like illegitimacy. He wouldn't like to be considered an illegitimate governor. That is something that he doesn't like. And he wouldn't like to become a Maduro, that he has an legitimate consideration all about the hemisphere. He wouldn't like to be considered to have somebody that is an alternative government to what he has, like the case of Venezuela. That he wouldn't like that. He doesn't like sanctions, and he doesn't like these sanctions when they get close to him and to his family, to his relatives. That is something that he doesn't like. He doesn't fear that. No, if he has to move forward, considering these circumstances, he may have to do it, and he may do it. So the thing is. The attraction for him of a fair election would be like the same one that Evo Morales had, that to keep on going as a legitimate government, and that is the challenge for him, and that is what the idea for electoral reform should be. How this and to have a fair elections, because you need for your next period, if you want to have a minimum of legitimacy, it will come only from a fair election. If not, you will just jump into the cliff of the Madurism and the Cuban. So that is the situation for him, and that could be the attraction for a fair election for him, and that is something that we need to push forward. And so far he's gaining time. That's his specialty. He's something that he does better than anyone, because he doesn't allow pressure to permeate his skin. He can go on. And pandemic is one thing, and elections in the United States is another thing. So he's taking profit of these two circumstances in order to try to move forward as far as he can within year 2021.
Let me add, sorry.
Go ahead, please.
No, just two additional points is that with your question about international pressure, I think the most important and effective way, apart from sanctions, which have been working, is that there has to be more support to the opposition. Daniel Ortega is both, he has two key features. He is a populist and a transactional politician. On the populist part, the one thing that Ortega cannot stand is that he loses popularity. He is always attentive to the people saying that they like the government or that they support. Even if his popularity may be as low as 20%, he still considers that's valid to him. So you have to neutralize that. And the way to neutralize it is giving more support to the opposition to gain greater relevance from the popular vote. The second part is neutralizing the sectors within the circle of power that are seeking to be dissidents. His transactional nature can be neutralized by removing different sectors from the dissidency who are unable to remove themselves from the government because they have no option. And the opposition has to offer some alternatives, an exit strategy to dissident groups in order to hand out support for the opposition on the one hand, but at the same time, lower the scales on the side of the government, make it more difficult for the government to stay in control of things. And here, again, my concern is not only Ortega. My concern is that currently the government is not simply run by Daniel Ortega. There is a cohort of groups, including his wife, people in the police, and people in parliament who have taken on practically the law in their hands and they need to be neutralized. So the international community, the US foreign policy needs to focus not only on sanctions directly to the government, but also in leveling the playing field of the opposition.
Well, let me follow that up with a question about, I liked your point about being a populist, who needs the people, and a transactional politician. Now, what is it, when we say we want to help the opposition, what is it that they would need in order to undercut the idea that this guy's actually a real populist? I mean, if you're taking care of your friends and you're taking care of your wife, it sounds to me like you basically got a corrupt strongman here. How do you get that message across, and what do you do to help people understand that what you see is not what you get?
Well, one of the things you need to do is to support more the media outlets, the independent media, which has been pivotal into bringing more public opinion to understand the corrupt nature of the government. In a context like Nicaragua, 10% of the population has lived under government subsidies that are conditioned to direct electoral support to the party of Ortega. And that has been basically one of those transactional components. The other one is the control of the monopoly of force of the police on the one hand through repression of the popular, of the people. So the support to the opposition implies giving more resources through technical assistance to independent media, to independent civil society organizations, to focus their attention on the popular imaginary into the Nicaraguan electorate to realize that they are not alone. When the electorate sees that the opposition has the backing of the international community, they feel more emboldened. And that's somewhat of a missing link that has taken place in Nicaragua. And so it does gives more confidence on the electorate, but also on the opposition that they are not alone in acting against the dictatorship. So the independent media is one of the central issues, but also civil society organizations need to have greater role in visibilizing the extent of corruption in the country, as well as the need for popular change, national change.
I would add to Manuel's comments that we need to work with our allies in the region and in the European Union so that they also recognize and treat the opposition as a viable alternative and as legitimate interlocutors. And that, includes, their support, their participation in high-level discussions, and this democratic solidarity that, in a way, has been lacking from at the highest levels, I would say, and consistently beyond the one that we have provided in the United States. I think that would be a very strong show of support. And adding to, I couldn't agree more with the support to independent media, but also to the efforts of making the pro-democratic forces more cohesive bodies, and sort of accompanying this process of building internal trust amongst themselves, so that when these elections happen, they do present like a cohesive force that can't be, penetrated, manipulated by, the mafia-like tactics that Ortega could produce. But certainly the political support and solidarity from our allies could be a much, much stronger and a huge help to legitimize them as valid interlocutors.
Well, if we were, though, to to
you allow, no, Robert, sorry, if you allow me, something about popularity, because I think for Ortega, the most this is a country and a political system of 35% government, and that is how what the constitution establishes and what is recognized in the constitution. So all what Ortega cares is to hold on to that 35%, because it's what may allow him to win elections. And there is something that Manuel somehow said, and it is very relevant to go to this point. It is, we need a stronger and harder commitment of the sub-region. We need that he should feel that the neighborhood is not pleased with this Nicaraguan situation. And everybody has to be doing that work. Nicaragua is a very relevant country. It's a belt there in Central America. So, and most of the trade in Central America is by truck. So it's, they need the path to pass through Nicaragua. And that is what Ortega makes relevant the government of Ortega to a certain point. He should feel that there is pressure from the neighborhood, and that is extremely relevant in order to make it work. Within the country, I think his popularity is in his minimum, and if there is, he knows that if there is fair elections, he will lose them. Today he will lose them. He doesn't trust that we may try to convince him that he may win, because that is a story that he already lived before, and that it has happened to him before. So he will not believe that anymore. He knows that he's not he doesn't have a fair chance to win the elections, and he will try to reach the date of the elections with keeping most of the conditions that the electoral system has now, and that will require pressure from international organization. We should start working in his legitimacy for next year, and we have to work very hard to create the political conditions and the electoral conditions in order to have a fair election. Civil society plays a role, media plays a role, but there is something that has been said too, that the opposition needs a more compact political organization and need some leadership that can really make viable an electoral solution in the country. That is something that is, even that the popularity is very low of Ortega, there is not a challenge in leadership. He's not facing anything like a challenge. The only maybe Lázaro Báez is the closest to what became a political leader after that the riots in a couple of years ago. But something else have to be built politically to have a real challenge against the Ortegas.
Well, if I can follow that up with the OAS has a really important role to play here. And the obvious question is, do you think that he will allow the OAS to observe the elections? But if we were to go back and take the point you just made and say, then he's got to understand that the neighborhood's not happy with him. Okay, so what do you see as the role of the OAS in, making that happen? Organizing the neighborhood and organizing the most significant of the neighbors to say, look, we're not happy here. And, when things start to go wrong, we're the ones who are going to have to pull you out of the difficulties.
He knows that his legitimacy mainly depends about what happens here within the organization. Here, here it was declared the legitimacy of the re-election of Maduro. Here was declared the legitimacy of the Maduro regime. Here it was somehow, it was recognized Guaidó, the representative of Guaidó to the Permanent Council. So he knows that if he has to agree with somebody about his the future legitimacy of the regime, of the situation of the system, political system in Nicaragua, it will be, he will have to deal with the Organization of American States, and he's like that, and and that's why he has kept always the door open to the work for electoral reform with the General Secretariat. But of course, that needs a little bit more these days. And today, as I said, the conditions are optimal for him to gain time at least till November, December, at least.
Well, but what do you propose in terms of, I tend to think in terms of lines of effort, so in terms of who does the OAS need to line up between, say, now and December of this year in terms of putting together an action plan that will take the group forward to November of 2021. I mean, there's a lot of work that needs to be done between now and the end of this year, There
is a lot of work that needs to be done. I'm always, I don't like to announce the main strategic lines that we follow. No,
right.
He may guess them, but
well, that's the whole point of a hidden agenda, is that it hidden, right?
But we need to put into action the mechanism, let's say, and the tools that we have within the organization and within the sub-region. And I think there are treaties, even in Central America, defending peace and democracy. I think there is a treaty of 1991, if I remember right. And things like that should be put into force and to carry on most of the struggle. I mean, if you see that, that was the way forward before, and that was what opened a solution for Nicaragua in the late 80s and end of the 90s. So the neighborhoods says, okay, we need Nicaragua to be a stable and democratic country because it's affecting the rest of us. And it's the role that is playing today in the international community, in the hemispherical community, it is very negative for the rest of Central America. And I think that is the main challenge. And that, of course, is we have to work very hard within the organization, but also at the sub-regional level, and the bilateral relations of the United States with the Central American countries is a key issue related to this. I mean, you can fix a negotiation and you can have a good negotiation, but to have a good negotiation, even for me to have a good negotiation, and I am always very grateful to those that put pressure. Some people that go for dialogue, for example, in Venezuela, I have seen that they are not grateful about those that put pressure. And I always very grateful about those that put pressure, because without that, there is no negotiation, there is no solution at all. Nobody will take seriously a negotiation if there is no somebody else putting the pressure on the situation. And that is that is a very relevant part.
Yeah, if I may add, in terms of international pressure, two-track diplomacy within the OAS is really important. On the one hand, it's important that the Secretary General participates in a negotiated, triangulated agreement with the government and the opposition to arrive at a common understanding on how to proceed electorally, with a commitment that is made public. But the other side of diplomacy requires that, especially on the side of the United States, that governments like Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, for example, have been playing the moral hazard of not voting at all times in the General Assembly on resolutions on Nicaragua because they're afraid that they might be next. The Honduran government has been very reluctant for many years to vote in the past 2 years on Nicaragua over the democratic charter because they fear that because they also been labeled as illegitimate government, they will be next. So the two-track diplomacy requires that effort working with Mexico too, which has been in the current government very reluctant to criticize the Nicaraguan government is essential, as well as some of the Caribbean states. Some are not going to change their position. Suriname, St. Kitts, among other states, are less likely to change their position, but there are other allies in the organization member states that will need or do need some nudging on the side of U.S. foreign diplomacy. And so I think, you need to have that two-track diplomacy in course to get towards in alignment with the opposition to move forward because the timetable is running fast. You have, by November of this year, the term limit for political party registration in Nicaragua for the next election. So if you want to make reforms to allow for new political parties under a new arrangement, the urgency of these negotiations are really important. And you also have expectations about the General Assembly meeting of the OAS in October over the case of Nicaragua and what the fate of Nicaragua might be in that context. So the timelines are pretty clear. After November, you will have a much more murkier scenario, considering that also the pandemic is doing a really bad deal to Nicaragua. There are at least 150,000 contagions taking place in the country. And by the end of the year, you will be talking of at least 300,000. So this is really a humanitarian crisis that needs to be addressed within the inter-American system. Not disregarding the European Union, the United Nations, but really the member states of the OAS play a crucial role in this process.
I'd like to precisely emphasize this final point, is that we need to send a clear message that it is at the OAS, with the OAS, where this must be resolved, where this crisis must be dealt with and resolved. Ortega may be looking for an alternative body, whether it is SICA that some people have mentioned, but it has to be within the OAS, and the OAS needs to be empowered to the fullest to deal with the situation, and this is where the scenario needs to happen. And I would also say that the National Coalition and the pro-democracy forces in Nicaragua could do a better work at international advocacy. They could also strengthen their capacity to reach out to other governments in the region, to speak to those the English-speaking islands of the Caribbean, the CARICOM countries, and their Central American counterparts. They also could help in this process, and to again reinforce that it is not with SICA, it is not some sort of bilateral solution with the United States, but with the OAS, and at the OAS where this needs to be resolved.
Well, that's a very good segue into the discussion of the role of civil society. And if I'm hearing you correctly, what you're suggesting is that that civil society groups should be reaching out to their counterparts in the neighborhood and elsewhere. Now, what's the best way to encourage them and support them in that process?
So absolutely. For example, the National Coalition and the main structures within the National Coalition, UNAB, Civic Alliance, they have international relations commissions that we've been hearing them for quite some time, but they don't seem to fully cook yet. And they need to get their act together, pardon my frankness here, but get their act together and really work towards presenting the case of Nicaragua to the neighbors and sort of do a mapping of who are the countries who need to be persuaded. Mexico, Guatemala, the CARICOM nations, and rely on their advantages and their strengths, which is a very broad coalition with people and leaders of very diverse ideologies and even ethnic backgrounds that could serve as relevant interlocutors and very legitimate interlocutors in the eyes of others.
Well,
and of course, there is also civil society groups, human rights organizations, and so on and so forth that do an excellent work in documentation. They all have their relevant networks to also work with civil society in those countries to sort of raise the public profile, in the media and so on about what is happening in Nicaragua and why should it matter in the region, sort of along the lines of what the Secretary General was saying, serving as Nicaragua as a beltway, in Central America and so on and so forth.
Well, we're just about out of time here. What I'd like to ask my colleague Ambassador Kozak to address the questions and certainly to offer our help from within DRL in helping put together some lists of people who can actually do the work that everybody's identified needs to be done. Unfortunately, it's very easy for those of us who are not there, to say, well, here's what needs to be done. It's a little harder to identify the people who actually need to do it. And so with that, I'm going to introduce my friend and colleague, Ambassador Michael Kozak. Mike, you're still on mute.
There we go. Thank you, Assistant Secretary Destro, Bob, and thank our esteemed guests for inviting me to participate in this important discussion this morning. We're living in an exciting moment for the Americas. The vast majority of countries in the region have transformed themselves into peaceful, vibrant democracies. The United States is engaged in favor of democracy and freedom and against authoritarian regimes consistently. We've partnered with many like-minded countries to build democratic institutions, support healthy civil society, and promote free press. These efforts are fully consistent with the Inter-American Democratic Charter, which marks its 19th anniversary this week on September 11th. Now, unfortunately, in this democratic hemisphere, this hemisphere of freedom, we have three outliers, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba, who insist on authoritarian models. The U.S. strongly supports the Nicaraguan people's call for democratic reform and free and fair elections. We believe the Nicaraguan people, not Ortega and Murillo, should decide the future of the country. As the opposition fights for democratic freedom and civil liberties, the U.S. government encourages diverse opposition groups to cooperate more effectively. We support the right of citizens to organize and gather peacefully. We support an independent, free press. We have said loudly and clearly to the Ortega regime, the repression must stop and the conditions must be created in which free and fair elections can go forward, which I think were beautifully lined out by the Secretary General. To date, the United States has sanctioned 22 Nicaraguan individuals, including the Vice President and 3 Ortega children, as well as 8 entities for their roles in serious human rights abuses, undermining democracy, or corruption. We revoked the visas of numerous individuals involved in the repression of peaceful protests. Our policy toward Nicaragua has bipartisan support in our Congress, and the United States will not be satisfied until the rights of all Nicaraguans are fully respected. The Ortega Murillo regime will be held accountable for its actions and inactions. And I would interject here that as the Secretary General said, they may think they're buying time waiting for our elections, but I get phone calls and emails every day from liberal Democrats who used to be fairly sympathetic to the Sandinista project in Nicaragua, who are beating up on us for not putting enough pressure on them. So this is something they ought to take into account, that this is not a issue where they can expect a lot of change in American policy. Now, the United States is not alone in working for accountability. The Ortegas are isolating themselves from the international community and world markets with their repressive actions. During the past year, Canada, the European Union, the United Kingdom announced their own sanctions against corrupt actors in Nicaragua. They, like us, recognize the regime's repression. Like us, they understand the urgency to shine a spotlight on the atrocious behavior and take action in support of freedom and civil liberties. We thank our partners at the OAS and Secretary General Almagro personally for their continued engagement. The OAS High-Level Commission on Nicaragua's November 2019 report highlighted the struggle of the regime's victim and their fight for peace and basic security. We believe the Commission's important findings warrant action and follow-up. We also value the report which the Secretary General presented to the OAS Permanent Council earlier this summer on the worsening condition in Nicaragua. As a consequence, several OAS member states, including the United States, support a draft resolution which will be presented at the October General Assembly to address the human rights situation in Nicaragua and lay down key markers for next year's electoral process. Likewise, we thank Manuel Orozco and Aimel Rios for playing key roles in fostering discussion and debate. The United States recognizes the value of a robust civil society and the free flow of ideas. As we look towards Nicaragua's 2021 election, we know time is of the essence. The ultimate resolution of the crisis lies with Nicaraguans. But here is the key point. For a fair democratic process to occur next year, the essential conditions for free and fair elections need to be put in place this year. Ortega and Murillo need to face up to this. So far, only certain individuals and institutions have been sanctioned, but that does not mean the others are immune. Ortega and Murillo's choice is between moving now to establish conditions for free and fair elections or facing a massive increase in pressure from the international community. Returning to the status quo before the April 2018 protests or even maintaining the current status quo is not an option for them. And this is something we hope they understand very, very clearly indeed. So with that, I thank you for engaging in this important discussion. It's been very helpful to me in crystallizing some ideas, and I return the floor to Assistant Secretary Destro. Thank you all again.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Kozak. And I just want to say, in terms of the wrap up for today, is what I hear and what I want to emphasize is that there's an awful lot of work to do. That if we're going to succeed at opening up the environment for real political debate and discussion in Nicaragua, it's going to have to be a team effort. And just as in every other team, we're going to have some pretty clear assignments of responsibility. That's a discussion, as the Secretary General quite wisely pointed out, that's not a discussion we have online, but it's certainly a discussion that we are eager to have with you. And my view is that the more specific we can be in terms of who's responsible for what, with the goal being really to empower the citizens of the long-suffering citizens of Nicaragua. You know, in the end, this is not about us. It's not about our views. It's about the freedom and equal opportunity of every Nicaraguan to get his or her views out there and to cast a free vote and to know you know what it is that people who purport to be representing them are actually up to. So with that, I thank you all for your participation this morning. Look forward to being back in touch with you, and we will again see you again, I hope soon. Thanks again for your participation this morning, and we'll see you all later.